This documentary has been made in order to examine the period between 1973 and 1991, the period of the Cold War. Events in this period, such as Détente, the war in Afghanistan, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the independence of satellite nations in Eastern Europe and Africa, will be analyzed and will result in the explanation of the collapse of the USSR. The 1970s marked a significant decrease in tensions between the Cold War powers of the world. This time period is often referred to as a period of détente. The U.S. called for détente following defeat in the Vietnam War. Diplomatic relations increased and between the U.S. and the communist states of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. China was admitted to the UN and gained international recognition in October of 1971. Then the U.S. began allowing the USSR access to U.S. technology under the policy of linkage. However, it did not come without challenges. Both the Yom Kippur War and the Angolan Civil War of the 1970s challenged this time of peace. The Angolan Civil War was a conflict that broke out following the independence of Angola in Africa. The USSR aided the communist MPLA, which took over most of the country. This aid angered the U.S. and nearly ended détente. Détente would survive this event, but it could not withstand the future actions of the USSR in Afghanistan.
Do you know what the term détente means?
No, I don't.
No, I sure don't. Never heard it.
Do you-
Détente.
That means stop doing it.
Yeah, and so in relation to the Cold War, around the 1970s, what did that term mean?
Stop the war.
Yeah, I guess.
Détente? Yeah, that's when both sides agree.
Okay, can you tell me what that means in relation to the Cold War?
No.
See, you said I wasn't going to have to be knowledgeable about that. I've heard it, but no, I don't know.
Okay, that's détente. It's a period of relaxed tensions between the U.S. and the USSR during the 1970s, during the Cold War. So knowing that, do you think the USSR was trying to maintain peace during that time period?
I guess not.
With us, yes, but not internally.
Okay.
Oh, that's a difficult question. I have no idea, but
I think they did.
You think they did?
They did, as well as I remember.
The end to détente would come in Afghanistan. In 1978, the PDPA overthrew Mohammed Daoud's regime and replaced him with Muhammad Turaki, who had signed a friendship treaty showing his communist tendencies with the Soviet Union. Islamic fundamentalists were angered, and a civil war broke out in 1979 that would bring Hafizullah Amin to power. The USSR proceeded to place 85,000 troops to intervene in the conflict because they did not want the communist revolution to be defeated in Afghanistan, and they feared that the U.S. would get more involved there with Amin in power. Their military action would be met by strong opposition in the U.S. The U.S. publicly disapproved of Soviet military invasion, stopped allowing the USSR access to U.S. technology, and boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. In addition, the Carter Doctrine justified American intervention militarily in order to preserve U.S. oil interest. The U.S. did not want the USSR to gain control over the massive oil reserves in Afghanistan after the devastating oil crisis of the 1971. The period of détente was brought to a close with the military invasion of Afghanistan with the U.S. and USSR.
What did the USSR have to gain by invading Afghanistan in 1979?
Well, Afghan and that whole Middle Eastern part of the world had a lot of oil reserves, so maybe to gain control over the oil industry.
Should America have gotten involved?
Well, I guess it all depends on whether we wanted to help out Afghanistan or not.
The Berlin Wall, completed in 1963, divided East and West Berlin with a large concrete wall topped with barbed wire. For almost 26 years, there was no travel between the two cities and became a physical reminder of the Cold War struggle until its collapse on November 9th of 1989. The wall had been a sign of the struggle between capitalism in the West and communism in the East that was symbolically ended as the wall fell and freedom prevailed, which foreshadows the events soon to come. What do you think that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall?
The fall of the Berlin Wall was led by desperation of the East German people to gain freedom. So the will of the people prevailed, and that eventually led to the destruction of the Berlin Wall. The American foreign policy, led by Ronald Reagan, was very instrumental in that too.
Very good answer. What do you think is significant about the fall of the Berlin Wall?
The wall was signifying basically division between humanity, and it was signifying loss of freedom. So when that came down, it showed that the people in Germany, East and West, are not different. They're all the same, and that was a good thing that happened. So that was very significant when the wall came down.
Good. All right. What do you think led to the fall of the Berlin Wall?
I don't know.
Okay. And what do you think is significant about the fall of the Berlin Wall?
It was a sign of the end of communism and freedom.
Okay. The USSR had control over Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other nearby countries until the late 1980s, when many of these countries gained independence. Gorbachev's policy of glasnost gave citizens of the USSR and its satellites much more freedom than what they were used to. This freedom led people to realize what it felt like to live under a less strict government, which allowed them to see themselves as part of their own country and not part of the USSR. This nationalism, paired with the freedom given by glasnost, led to mostly peaceful opposition to the USSR's control over its satellites from the citizens of those satellites. Poland was one of the first to gain independence, which used the opportunity to create its own government that was not communist. The separation of these states from the USSR was one of the factors that would lead to the fall of the Soviet Union. After years of extensive military spending, years of struggle between communism and capitalism, multiple changes of leadership in a short amount of time, and a new rise of nationalism and satellites put pressure on the USSR. This led to Gorbachev making reforms and impending new policies to fix these problems. One new reform was glasnost, which allowed for openness to criticism of past mistakes. Another was perestroika, which Gorbachev introduced in 1987 that was aimed towards reconstructing and modernizing Russia, which actually made Russia more unstable in the short term. Also in 1987, a new reform called the Law of Cooperatives, which for the first time in Soviet history allowed for the private ownership of businesses. None of these reforms were enough to keep the USSR above water, though, and therefore it sank and was dissolved on December 25th of 1991.
What do you think about Gorbachev's reform policies near the end of the Cold War?
I have no idea what they are.
What do you think particularly about the glasnost policy?
I've never heard of that in my life.
What do you think particularly about the perestroika policy?
I don't know.
How much of a contribution do you think these states had on the fall of the Soviet Union?